You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. So, before I get into the content of today's podcast, let me just extend a very warm thank you to Grace and Art, Rish Thakkar and Nate Munoz, who joined me and Dr. Mark Williams in the last podcast for an hour-long conversation about the issue of Jordan Peterson and some of the shortcomings, in a sense, about the message that he provides, especially or essentially to men. So, whilst I'm on the issue of thanks, let me also then thank Dr. Mark Williams, a friend and colleague of mine, who we share a whole bunch of intellectual and academic ideas and thoughts that I think are really crucial at this point in time in our history. So it was wonderful to have everybody there. And what I particularly liked was the fact that, Mark and I are fundamentally the seasoned guard. I often refer to myself, not in a derogatory way, but as a silverback gorilla. My hair is the dead giveaway for that. But it's also about the idea that we are now moving into an age, well, especially me, but also Mark to some degree, where we, in a way, are looking for the next generation to carry the torch, because there needs to be, that idea of legacy. We need young men to start critically examining themselves, the attitude, beliefs, and values that they hold, both about themselves, but about issues like gender, climate, the economy. I keep coming back to this idea that we've been spun stories that have become highly destructive. I place the argument in front of everybody to suggest that we're living in an economic feudal system. Neoliberalism has, crushed the middle class, which is in fact the very mechanism wherein we experienced a heightened sense of prosperity and well-being during the 50s and 60s and the first parts of the 70s. But it wasn't to be. In came people like Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, Alan Greenspan, Ayn Rand, who essentially embarked on a project of social engineering to restate and reinvest in the conservative ideals and ideologies that they felt were appropriate. So out with the progressive, in with the old, and society was going to be the better of it. And in fact, the transition was from more of a social policy perspective in politics to an economically driven one. I'm not going to dwell on this in this podcast. I'm just laying it down there. So, part of the reason why I am bringing it up is Jordan Peterson is one of those, in my book, dinosaurs who harkens back to the good old days and to tradition and family values. And don't get me wrong, I am absolutely committed to the whole idea of family values. But the question is, what sort of values are we going to embrace and articulate in our day-to-day living? And, my concern is that the ideas, to a large degree, coming from people like Jordan Peterson and the ilk that's around him, is that those ideas, those ideals are just as toxic as what we've had through neoliberalism, through the whole patriarchal framework. We need to divest. And I keep talking about deconstruct patriarchy, and we will begin to see a massive shift in things like social awareness, personal awareness, including well-being, physical and psychological well-being. So part of the last show was, if I'm going to condense it a bit, just to, catch everybody up a little bit, it was firstly the question of resistance to persuasion. Okay, so one of the things that I asked the young guys was fundamentally, what is it that inoculated you against the sort of indoctrination of someone like Jordan Peterson? And it was fascinating because the guys confirmed to me what I see in therapy and in coaching and in groups all the time. And that is, firstly, if you've had an experience of an autocratic father figure like Jordan Peterson, you're either going to try and embrace it, in other words, to try and get the love and affection from that idealized person that you didn't get from the real person in your life, or you would have had a childhood and an adolescent where you got to enjoy a secure attachment with your caregivers so that you didn't need to sort of grapple and try to find some facsimile or avatar that represents the father, the real father or the mythological father in some sense. And so, I think this is an extraordinarily important aspect when we're trying to examine the lives of men. Okay? And it has bearing too on the lives of women, but particularly speaking, I'm looking at it from the, through the lens of masculinity. So their stories to me were extremely thought-provoking and touching, as they always are, not just with these guys, but with any male that I work with. Because the big myth that's been going around in many respects has been that idea that somehow we as men are emotionally wanting. It's a myth that's perpetuated a lot of times by men themselves, that we lack emotional complexity. And frankly, I call bullshit on that. We don't. We are actually emotionally highly complex, but we have defense mechanisms that we've gathered through our socialization that has overlaid our emotional complexity with a very simplistic two-dimensional sort of construct. It fits the patriarchal idea of all good things are binary. Good, they're bad, they're successful, they're a failure, all that sort of stuff. And again, not real. It's a story that we're telling ourselves, or that we've been told, and been told to adhere to it. Okay? So this two-dimensional story that's been perpetuated is one that I think that we need to be, constantly vigilant for. We need to, shed those defense mechanisms that constrain us to being, emotionally flatlined in a way. And so part of that comes through rethinking what being male really means to me and to men in general and in relationship to women. And it's not a two-dimensional story. It's not about alpha males. And you've heard me debunk that notion about alpha males time and time again. And if you're really interested in that story, both the points of origin about the alpha male, but also the critique of that by the originator himself, is search out a guy called Franz de Waal, and he's done an enormous amount of work with primates, and he's a fascinating character, and he looks at the whole gender issue and things like politics and so on through the lens of the primate. And no matter how we slice and dice it, folks, we are primates. We just happen to be a bit more sophisticated in some ways, but sometimes I despair for the lack of our, compassion and ethics that are often displayed within the animal kingdom, especially amongst primates. Now, are we always like chimpanzees? Probably not. We're certainly definitely not like gorillas, who happen to be, in my experience, looking at this area, relatively peaceful. Chimpanzees have got a nice aggressive edge to them. When I say nice, I'm being sarcastic. I tend to think that we probably get a lot more out of watching primates through the lens of the bonobo. So those of you who are interested in pursuing, learning more about that, to learn more about yourself, please explore that. Okay. And I'll probably do some more podcasts along those lines. Now, don't get me wrong. I am not promoting evolutionary psychology here. I'm not saying because primates do X, we do Y. There is some of that's true, but again, let me come back to the lobster theory. Just because lobsters, appear to have a dominance hierarchy doesn't mean human beings naturally, instinctively, intuitively in their DNA have a propensity towards the dominance hierarchy. In fact, we don't. Anthropology, sociology, psychology shows us that that's not the case. When we orientate ourselves to the right data, the right scientific research. So, if we're going to expand this, my argument is that we need a new story about men. We need one that's much more rich in complexity and in its explanatory power. Why are we the way that we are? So the first cab off the rank for that, and this is what I want you to take out of this particular podcast, is that the new story doesn't talk about masculinity. It talks about masculinities. It was a concept that was coined by Connell in 2005. She's a feminist academic, and she really got into that whole notion of multiple masculinities. That there is more than one kind of masculinity, and that what's considered to be masculine differs by race, by class, by ethnicity, by sexuality, and by gender. So, to expand that argument, fundamentally, masculinity, therefore, is a social construct which is distinct from male biological science. So, just because you have a penis doesn't define your masculinity. Definitions of masculinity do strongly vary across cultures and even historical periods. And this is a really important idea, folks, and that is that both males and females can perform masculinity and femininity. And this is where a lot of people get their knickers in a knot, especially when it comes to gender orientation at work and, the whole idea, so for example, women can't be in the armed forces because they can't do what men do in the armed forces. Bollocks. Let's check out what's happening in the Ukraine and what's happened traditionally throughout history, where women have performed their part in combat. Certainly World War II was also a really good example of that. So it is important then that we define masculinity as a set of thoughts, feelings, and behaviours that are generally considered to be appropriate for boys and men. All right? Now, here's the trick with that. That's changing. That landscape is changing. And one of the things that it demands is that we men become more flexible, and patriarchy makes us rigid. So, to cap this bit off, remember, masculinity is not hardwired due to genes and hormones, and it is not essential nor inescapable for boys and men. We can get our gender identities without conforming to the general notions, the general thoughts, emotions, and behaviours that we consider the norm in masculinity. So, that's really important. Now, let me just address one other aspect here, which I think is critical, and that is the notion of toxic masculinity. Okay, now, despite popular belief, feminists, or as some of the boys want to refer to feminists as feminazis, did not coin, that description. Essentially, now I don't like talking about toxic masculinity because it really confuses a bunch of issues. So where did that idea come from? Okay, so it didn't come from feminists, and it didn't come out of the Me Too movement, right? So let's put it in a historical context. It fundamentally arose from the mythopoetic men's movement of the 1980s and 1990s, and really has its basis ultimately in psychoanalysis and stemming primarily from the work of Carl Jung. Okay, so now we get an overlap. Jordan Peterson, Carl Jung, fanboy. Okay, and I'm not right here and now going to do a critical analysis of why some of this has some major problems. Apart from the fact that the mythopoetical movement, in particular the ideas of a guy called Michael Mead and Sam Keen, focused on the absence of mythological spirituality in most people's lives, especially men. And so they began to focus on the notion of looking at traditional anthropological groups like the traditional tribesmen in Africa, the Hausa, Celtic traditions in Ireland, and so on, and to try and gain some sense of what's missing in our cultural landscape that could help men and boys to grow as a human being and to operate at a much healthier level. So when we talk about toxic masculinity, we're talking about those thoughts, behaviors, attitudes, values that are not healthy for either men or women or children. In other words, they're toxic. The thoughts, attitudes, beliefs, and ideologies are toxic to our society as a whole, our culture. Okay, makes sense? So I do play a very sort of strong game about being specific in language. So to me, masculinities are different representations of what it means to be male and female, and that we need to really separate out and identify the thoughts, feelings, attitudes, and so on. Well, feelings generally are not toxic, but thoughts, attitudes, values that are toxic to myself and others. Make sense? So it's a really important distinction. And I thought I'd focus on that because there's so much stuff thrown around in this arena. And I want people to have a stronger and more accurate knowledge base about what we're talking about this, because this has implications about a whole range of things, about how I conduct myself as an individual, how I am as a partner, how I, operate within my family, my community, at work, as an academic, as a therapist, as a doctor. All these things are totally and completely relevant. Okay. I hope that's been useful, and in the next session I'm going to pick up a little bit more about, let's look at how there could be different masculinities and how we operate together. And remember, according to the new story of masculinity that I put forward in Making Good Men Great, my book on surfing a new masculinity, it's about being inclusive and it's about being cooperative. And stop being territorial. This is not a pissing contest. And on that note, I'm going to leave you until the next time. Take care, live well.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit makinggoodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda at noartainment.com. That's Miranda at NOIRTAINMENT.com.